Hi, I'm Sharon Golan. I'm the Director of Content Licensing here at Infobase, and today I'm speaking with Professor Carly Thomsen about her film In Plain Sight, which is available on Films on Demand for our university subscribers and on Access Video on Demand for our public library subscribers. In Plain Sight focuses on the experiences of LGBTQ women in rural communities. It shows that their experiences are quite different from the stereotype we've come to believe, and the film invites us to question how we have come to imagine what life is like for LGBTQ women in rural places and provides us an opportunity to imagine it otherwise. Carly, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just delighted to be here and to have this conversation with you.
So am I. I'm very excited to get started. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Middlebury College. And I primarily work in the areas of queer theory and reproductive justice. And I also do a lot of work specifically on crisis pregnancy centers and then about place and space. And so I try to bring a critical analysis of how place is constructed, not just the impacts of place on people's lives, but how we actually have come to think about place to all of my work, like regardless of what I'm talking about. And, this project happened to be about LGBTQ identified women in rural places, and the insights that I've developed through the research that led to the film are insights that I try to bring to my work more broadly. And I think part of the reason for that, this is, I guess, supposed to be an introduction of myself, not my work, but is the reason I'm bringing this up is that I'm originally from rural South Dakota. That's where I was born and raised. And the places where I've lived have really shaped how I understand the world. And I didn't realize that the Midwest was thought of in disparaging ways until I actually left the Midwest. And, I spent the first 25 years of my life living in Minnesota, South Dakota, and I briefly lived in Wisconsin and Nebraska. And so my whole knowledge of the world was rooted in Midwestern perspectives and sensibilities. And I would say feminist and queer Midwestern sensibilities, but nonetheless Midwestern. And when I got to grad school, I realized that people called this whole area that had been the basis of my life the flyover zone. And I found that so offensive and also like so curious and in this way, like really interesting. Like, how is it that people from LA primarily are talking about the vast majority of this country in this way? And so I think that where I'm from really, really structures how I approach my intellectual work.
Thank you. And why did you focus specifically on LGBTQ women in this film?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Well, I feel like this is a big question right now in a way that it would not have even been a question that people asked when I set out to do the research or make the film, in part because discourses of transness and non-binariness just were not as ubiquitous in 2012 when I started this as they are today. So I will say the reasons why in 2011, when I really started thinking about this project, that I decided to focus on women is because all of the scholarship in rural queer studies up to that point had focused on men, all of it. There wasn't a single book that focused on LGBTQ women in rural places, and there wasn't a single book about LGBTQ women in the Midwest either. And so I wanted to think about like, how would the scholarship that I'm reading in rural queer studies that's focused entirely on men, how would some of the assumptions of this scholarship be troubled if there was a different gender at the center of the analyses? And so that was why I started to focus on women, like all of the cultural representations, all of the scholarship. I mean, it's not like there were no discussions of rural queerness, but it was like Brokeback Mountain or documentaries about gay cowboys, right? So that's like a very small part of rural life. It's a lot of the stereotypes of rural life, but there's a lot of rural life that's not captured in those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of representations.
Mm-hmm.
So so that's why I started focusing on women in part. And the other thing is, like, in feminist studies, and we often joke, and not just feminist studies, in social sciences and humanities, often people joke that research is me search. And so there was a part of it too, that it's like, as a queer person from rural South Dakota, that I was kind of curious, could I find patterns in the world that can help me make sense of the differences that I'm seeing in how I approach questions in relation to my queer colleagues who are from urban areas, and we're bringing very different perspectives to these texts or to our readings of things. And how can I understand that? And what is the role of place in those different understandings? So that was why I started focusing on women. I will say, though, that I asked in my calls for interviewees for my book initially, I asked for LGBTQ identified women or women who love and desire women. And that framing in 2012, when I started doing these interviews, that was a framing that led me to interview trans masculine people and also trans women. So, I mean, it's not really a surprise that trans women would feel included in a call for LGBTQ women, but it is a little bit surprising today to people that call, that language also resonated enough with people so that trans masculine people also felt hailed and were interested in being interviewed. And so so those are some of the reasons. And I guess, like, just in terms of scholarship and numbers, there are actually of the LGBTQ people who live in rural places, there's a greater percentage of women than any other gender. And also, women are more likely to report feeling happy and supported and to actually desire living in rural places than other people of other genders who are LGBTQ. So I thought it's very curious here that there are more women than people of other genders who are LGBTQ identified and who live in rural areas. And there's still no scholarship about these people. And they're more likely to want it and desire it and feel happy in these places. And there's still no scholarship. But how do we understand this really outside of, like, sort of simply, it's just it's just sexism, right? Like, there's no focus on women. And so that was the book, and then for the film that emerged out of the book, I interviewed primarily people who I had already interviewed for my book. So I already had a relationship with these people. And I think that was really important for making a film with people who aren't typically the kinds of people who would think that their stories are worthy of being on film, or or themselves being filmed. And so I think a lot of people were a little bit nervous. It's nerve-wracking to have a camera in front of your face and to feel like you have to say things in a particular way or to be followed throughout your day. It brings attention to you, which isn't always wanted, and it makes you stand out, which isn't always wanted. And so I think it was really, really important, actually, that in my case and with this topic, that I already had a relationship with all of the people who are participants in the film.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it definitely lends weight to this argument that these women do feel supported and do feel happy and do feel included, because if that was not true, they wouldn't want to volunteer to be interviewed and to be in this film.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was I think one of the paradoxes actually is that my book is called Visibility Interrupted, and it's working against some of the ideas that mainstream gay rights activists and urban-based LGBTQ people have relied upon for a really long time around visibility, that visibility is itself evidence of progress, and that we should all make ourselves visible at all moments in the service of social justice. And I mean, I think there's a lot of assumptions there that in my book that, I argue are wrong. And for the most part, the people I interviewed didn't have any interest in visibility within their rural LGBTQ communities. but that didn't mean that they didn't feel like they were out, or that they didn't feel like they were known, or nobody felt closeted, but also people were very critical of a lot of the kind of mainstream gay approaches to visibility. And yet they all also agreed to be in a film on screen, being represented. So I think that it was, one of the paradoxes of doing a book that's critical of visibility and then making a video also that's on the same topic, but asking different questions, actually.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Now, the film also introduces a concept called metronormativity.
Yeah.
Can you explain what it is and why it's important?
Yeah. So this is a term that was coined by a queer and trans theorist whose name is Jack Halberstam. And Halberstam says that there's this way that people think about rural places as always already backwards, as insufficient, as anachronistic. And the assumption is that everybody wants to get to the big city. And there's these kinds of ideas, these kinds of sentiments are normalized within LGBTQ spaces. And so Halberstam calls this metronormativity, or the kind of normalizing of the ethos of metropolitan or urban areas. And part of the result of this is a real flattening of differences between spaces, right? Like we wouldn't assume that we assume that differences among people matter typically, but when it comes to spatial differences or where people are from, those differences get flattened in the name of social progress, right? That like it is necessarily better for people to move from rural places to urban places, because necessarily those places are more welcoming and less hateful and homophobic. And of course, the data suggests otherwise, that there's, for instance, no more hate crimes per capita in rural places than there are in urban areas, even though most people probably don't think that. And more LGBTQ people report higher levels of happiness in rural places than in urban places. And yet those are the kinds of statistics and figures that seem almost unbelievable. And the reason they seem unbelievable is because of metronormativity. It's the degree to which the urban or the metro has become synonymous with just place, right? But there are differences among places, and those differences matter.
Yeah, so I think the film does really explore the tension between rural and urban through the lens of gay identity. And that includes, what we were talking about with visibility and what that means. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the other research in this area.
Yeah. So, when I set out to make this film, I thought that it was going to be a vehicle for sharing the insights, the intellectual insights of my book. And it turns out that that was entirely wrong. And it was not going to be really a vehicle for that. And it became its own thing. And I had to kind of let go of what I thought the film would be and just let the film become the thing that it was. And in many ways, the medium allowed me to make arguments that I never could have made in print. And that was really a neat thing to see. So for instance, like the film includes a lot of clips of famous people, celebrities, actors, commenting, making very metronormative comments and claims. And you just see them over and over and over. And that's the kind of thing that it doesn't have the same power when it's just in writing as it does when you see, wow, these ideas are so commonsensical. They're so taken for granted. And yeah, and so just seeing that the film could allow me to think about my research in a different way was really a really neat thing actually as a scholar. Like I don't see I still don't really see myself as a filmmaker. I see myself as a scholar. And I wanted to make this film because I believe in the value of academic feminist and queer studies. And I wanted to create something that would allow these theoretical ideas to circulate in a broader way. But I didn't, so I thought that it was going to be me. This film was a chance for me to translate my ideas into a different medium for a broader audience. But in fact, it became something that was entirely different. And it made me reflect on the research differently. So the research, to actually answer your question, sorry, I initially, when I started this, I began looking at cultural representations, like what kinds of other examples of rural queerness can I find, especially positive examples like blogs or vlogs or WordPress sites or MySpace pages back in the day, you know, and YouTube videos, any movies, and there was almost nothing positive. I mean, there's like Boys Don't Cry, which ends not very well, right? And there was just almost nothing about women, and there was almost nothing about anything that's positive. And so I then thought, well, I guess I have to create my own archive because there is no archive that exists. I can't write a dissertation about rural queerness and women if there's like, where am I looking? So that's how I decided to do interviews. And I ended up interviewing more than 50 LGBTQ identified women or women who love and desire women. And yeah, we met, we talked, and you know, some of the interviews were, some of them were long, like between 1 and 4 hours.
Wow.
And many of the women I've kept in touch with over the years. And I mean, now it's been more than 10 years since I initially interviewed people. And it's interesting, like, just like with everything else, you connect more with some people than other people. Or I think for some people doing the interview was more profound than it was for other people. And, you know, when I decided to do the film, of course, like the people I connected with, some of them, it was just based on geography, like South Dakota and Minnesota are huge states. And I was working with a small team of mostly students, and like, where can we go? How close of proximity is it to my parents' house where we can stay for free? And that's the kinds of decisions that led me, you know, those are the kinds of things I was using to make my decisions regarding who I would interview out of my pool for the film, out of my pool of interviewees for the book. And yeah, and so it's funny because one person I called to ask if she would do an interview, and you know, I've been poring over their words for years at this point. And then I finished saying like, oh yeah, I interviewed you for my dissertation a couple of years ago, and I'm coming back and doing this film, and I'm wondering if you might be interested in being interviewed. And then there was this kind of slightly too long pause, and then she goes, who is that? Because like, this person's life had become central to my life, you know, just like that's what research is. Like, I was poring over details of her life in relation to the lives of all these other people. And it was like,
and she
almost
just went back to normal.
like, totally. She was like, and then I said something and she was like, oh yeah, I kind of remember talking to you. And that was, you know, that was somebody who then I reconnected with, versus other people, like I became Facebook friends with them. Somebody invited me to their wedding, right? Like,
oh, wow.
it was just like different, totally different, you know, people are people, and you can't keep in touch with everybody, but you keep in touch with some people. And I think that either way, yeah, I developed real relationships out of some of these interviews, and people who, like, every time I go home and to see my parents, I have lunch or wine with one of the people I interviewed, and I have been doing that for years now. So I think that, like, to me, that's all a part of research, right? It's like, this is participant observation. It's like, how do you gain data and information? Well, it's like you engage in the world. And part of that is having conversations with people. And so I would say there's, a lot of insights that I gained from my research, many of which didn't end up getting into the film, but the film led to different research insights that I actually ended up reflecting on in the conclusion of my book. And so that was a really neat thing to see. I thought this was going to be unidirectional, like my book research influences the film, but it turns out that making the film also influenced my analyses of my research.
That's very cool. I'm going to go off our script a little bit and ask you if you're thinking, if there's any value in doing a follow-up, given that you've kept in touch with all of these people, so many of these people, would you consider doing a follow-up, and what would you focus on if you were to do another film?
This is a really good question.
And I gave you no time to think about it.
That's okay. Here's the thing. I had never made a film before. This was my first attempt. I'm very technologically challenged, and I was working with almost no budget. Like I had a couple of student research assistants who helped me in various ways, finding cultural representations, editing the film, things like this. But like, this was a very low budget film that we made with love and passion and not a lot of material resources. Thankfully my parents let me borrow their car when I would come home, things like that. But it also takes a lot of, anybody who's made a film knows that it's going to take you way more time and way more resources than you thought it would take. So I'm not sure that, I don't know that I'll make another film, because I just don't know. But I have in the last year worked with other people who have been making films, and I really like to do that. So I think that it's a very valuable medium for communicating complex ideas to a wide audience, and also to probably a wider audience than is going to pick up a feminist or queer theory book. So I very much value the medium, and I would like to keep using it, but I don't think that there will be a follow-up on this topic, probably only because there's like, in this moment, it's hard. I mean, it's a very different moment than 10, 11 years ago when I started this research. And right now it's hard for me to think about very many social issues that are outside of the kind of contemporary concerns that are motivating a lot of activism around reproductive justice, around racial justice. And of course, like, I talk a lot about race and racialization and racism in my book. But I think it's like, it's just a different moment. And I don't know that I'll do another film about rural queerness, but if I did, I think I would want something that focused and told like a deep dive into a person's life that then allowed you to explore something conceptually from that person's life. Versus when I set out to make this film, I set out to tell a story that was an argument, not that's a story about one person's life. And I think through the film, you get pieces of people's lives. Like the interviewees are featured and they tell you about their lives, but you don't see one person's day-to-day life in a lot of depth. And so that is something that I could imagine working on in the future, potentially. So I guess that was a really long-winded and circuitous answer, because I started with no, I won't probably do a follow-up. 2, if I did a follow-up, it would probably be about a different topic. To 3, I think you have a really good idea, and a follow-up would be wonderful. So.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's go back to the film that you did make. So in the film, Dr. Katie Schweighofer makes the point that the tension that we see between urban and rural doesn't allow us to think critically about what it's like to be gay in big cities like New York and San Francisco. And she also points out that it shortchanges local voices in these rural communities. How or why do you think these stereotypes developed?
Yeah, these are really good questions. Well, I think that part of what Dr. Schweighofer was asking us to think about is how the rural becomes scapegoated and how the rural becomes the problem in such a way that it makes it almost impossible to critically reflect on ongoing problems in urban areas, right? And it's not like the LGBTQ scene in New York City or San Francisco is devoid of sexism and racism and classism and ableism. Of course, that's not the case. And there's a lot of scholarship that shows how urban LGBTQ scenes are full of these social ills, these problems. And I'm thinking of Martin Menelanson's work, for instance, on Filipino immigrants and how there are racialized areas of New York City, and that queer immigrant spaces aren't in the areas that people think of as New York City's gay scenes. And so I think that speaks to how deeply racism runs through LGBTQ spaces. And that's maybe even more prominent in urban areas, contrary to popular belief. So I think those are the kinds of things that become difficult for us to figure out how we would address when there's always already a place that's more backwards, where things are worse than they are here. And the rural is always that place. The non-West is always that place. And so I think the urban West gets a pass too often. And it would be much more beneficial for LGBTQ organizing if people could see just the dynamic nature of LGBTQ life in rural places, and also not assume that LGBTQ spaces have that same dynamism in urban spaces, right? That yeah, and I think that's a kind of key impulse of the film, is to get us to think more critically about ideas about urban space just as much as it is to get people to think critically about their ideas about rural space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many ways, these ideas come from urban-based gay rights activists. Like when people think of the main LGBTQ rights organizations in this country, they're all based in urban areas. They're almost all based on urban coasts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who don't live in urban areas and don't live on coasts, right? And so when the perspectives of, I mean, of course, it seems obvious to me that where you are located, the perspectives of that place inform your movements. They inform your thinking, and that informs your movements. And so if we took more seriously the kinds of local organizing that happens outside of those mainstream, often actually quite conservative gay rights groups, we would have a very different understanding of what sexuality looks like, but also what resistance looks like. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is an expansion on what Dr. Schweighofer was saying, and I think a really key part of the film.
Yeah, that leads very nicely into my next question. And as an urban person, I say this as an urban person, I think there are some observations in the film that I didn't consider. For example, Dr. Colin Johnson's observation that knowing how to talk across lines of difference is a necessary skill for gay people in rural communities. And that just seems like such a missed opportunity. Can you talk about some other lessons we should consider regarding gay identity and this geographic dimension?
Yeah, so that line is one of my favorite in the whole film. I think it's just brilliant that people assume that we don't have any lessons to learn from rural people or rural life because it is often thought of as just very simple, as very backwards, right? Like what do urban people, what do progressive people have to learn from people in rural places? Most people would say not much, right? And so Colin is saying, well, we actually have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn in terms of how we communicate with each other and also in terms of how we build movements, right? If there are fewer people in an area, you are sometimes forced to get along with people in a way that, like, when you have many more options, you can write people off. But if you can't write people off just because, like, as Colin put it in the field, the marketplace doesn't allow that because the market isn't big enough. You can't write people off. Well, I think then you learn really valuable skills about how to collaborate, how to compromise, and how to build a movement that works better for more people, right? And I think those are great lessons. And then, there are also, I think, a lot of intellectual lessons that we can learn from people in rural places, including the real dangers of homogenizing entire swaths of people, because rural people, just like a lot of other people who have been stereotyped and grouped together based on one aspect of themselves, like people of color or women, LGBTQ people, there are a lot of differences among people who also have similarities. And so how can we, I think, foster actually those differences in a way that doesn't threaten cohesiveness in a way, right? And I think it's a really good lesson. I think there are political lessons to learn, like from people in places where, again, you are forced to work together in a way that, like, if you have long been going to church with multiple generations of a family and you would politically disagree, you have a basis from which you can have a disagreement that allows you to take seriously somebody else's perspective without writing them off as monsters. And I think that, like, in this political moment, too few of us have conversations with people who politically disagree with us. And I think in rural places, that's much more difficult if you want to talk about politics. Now, not everybody talks about politics. Sometimes people don't. But also in this moment, I mean, I think post-Trump, it's a lot more people are emboldened to talk about politics in really problematic ways. But the result is that other people have felt compelled to talk about politics when they maybe wouldn't have before. And so, like, for instance, my dad has been writing letters to the editor of the paper pretty frequently in my hometown, and he did not do that pre-Trump. And so I think that is, and the thing is, it's different if you do this in a bigger area where you go to the store and no one's going to know who you are if you're the person who submitted that op-ed that's running counter to what other people are saying in their op-eds, right? So I think it's like, it requires actually more boldness in some ways and more belief in your fellow people, right? Like, you have to believe that after people read this, that they can still get along with you, that you can still get along with them, even after that you politically disagree. And I think those are really valuable lessons. And it's hard to get the full lesson when you're writing off an entire group of people as stupid and anachronistic and conservative.
Yeah, I agree. That is definitely a very good lesson, and not one that is constrained to a particular group, but one that everybody could benefit from.
Yes.
So let's talk about the music video at the end of the film.
Yeah.
I really like it.
It's my favorite part, I think. Yeah. Well, So a couple of students who were working with me as research assistants one summer, they were working on my research team. And to be honest, I don't even know how the idea initially came up. I remember where we were sitting when the idea came up, and we just decided to make a music video as a kind of like fun summer activity. Like they'd been working really hard on various research questions, collecting data, and it was the summer, and I was like, let's do something fun. Or I'm not saying I had the idea for the music video, but I think that the students had the idea for the music video. And then we just started like playing around with lyrics, and I am not musical, and luckily I was working with two students who are extremely musical in terms of like having the capacity to write a song, to play the music, to sing the song in a beautiful way. And then, you know, there were students around in the summer who were friends with Nell and Charlotte, who were the two students who really took the lead on developing the song, writing it and singing it, and then putting together the music video. And it was meant to be silly and campy and to really represent a queer aesthetic. And I think that we managed that. You know, it's like it is, I find it hilarious, and it's not meant, I think it suggests that we can talk about these things in a way where we don't end up taking them so seriously that at the end of the day, it's not even fun. And really, I think that learning should be joyful, and I think thinking should be pleasurable. And we don't need to always hit people over the head with an idea in order for it to resonate. And I think like making this video was an attempt to just be playful with an idea, but also do so in a way that really mocks metronormative ideas.
Yeah, and you also have a guarantee here that the students definitely understood this class.
Yeah, they sure did. They made it clear to me with this music video that they had learned everything that I had hoped they would ever learn about rural queerness. That's for sure. Yeah, I thought that it was really clever. And, you know, and like I said, I'm not a musician. I don't write songs. I don't play music. I don't play instruments, I should say. And I was like dreaming about lyrics. I was dreaming, and I would wake up and I would write them down really fast. And then I would email my RAs and be like, oh, I had these ideas. And they would mostly be like, veto, that is way too cheesy. There's no way. I mean, and the video is already cheesy. So you know that like, if they were telling me that my suggestions were too cheesy, they were hyper cheesy. And they mostly rejected all of my ideas, and I think the song, it was better for those rejections.
Well, it's really nice to have a piece of your students in the film also.
I agree, it's very special.
Yeah. So how do you expect the film to be used in the classroom?
Yeah, well, some of my rural queer studies colleagues and friends have used it and have reported positive results. So I guess my real hope is that ideally people would assign chapters of the book and would watch the film and also use the In Plain Sight website as a teaching tool. There's on the website, there are some lesson plans. There are other videos that include examples of metronormativity in films or in TV shows that were beyond what was included in the film, just for the sake of time. So we have additional resources on the In Plain Sight website that I think correspond really well to the message of the film. And so my real hope is that people would, you know, here's the book. that people would assign the book alongside the film and use the website as a teaching resource, and use that as part of, you know, intro to LGBTQ studies classes, queer theory classes, decolonial feminism classes, intro to feminist studies. There's a lot about this project, the film and the book, that are asking us to rethink politics and geography. So I could imagine that this would be useful in geography classes and political science classes, in a bunch of interdisciplinary areas too, you know, like American studies, for instance. So our performance studies. So yeah, I hope that scholars will find it to be a useful teaching tool, and I hope that students find it a useful learning tool.
I hope so too. Did you make any surprising discoveries while you were producing the film?
Well, I will say that the most surprising discovery was just how much work it is. And we ended up with so much footage, and I had no idea going into this, like, how painful it would be to me to have to cut it, or to not be able to include so much of what we had captured. And people who are veterans at filmmaking, this is like probably just such an obvious thing to say, but as somebody who is brand new to this, it felt physically painful to me to not be able to include what felt like a really crucial nugget that somebody said. And or like some what I thought was beautiful B-roll, or interesting, or some like a funny moment that was like a reflection of a connection that I had with an interviewee. Those were kind of, yeah, I guess I just had no idea how damn hard it is to make a movie, and how how like affectively attached I would become to the different pieces of the project, and how grueling it would be to then have to cut some of those pieces of the project. But that's, I guess, all of a part of making something that tells a story, right? Is that there's curating and there's editing, and everything that you think and all the things you learn don't get to be a part of the final project, you know? So the same is true in that way of a book and a film, that there were so many insights that I had along the way that it's just not possible to include them all. And I don't know, I don't think that's a very good answer to your question, but I think that's the best I've got right now.
I thought it was a good answer. It's a good answer, and it leads into our discussion about the process of making a film. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about like what it took to get to the point where you were filming, and the process that you went through, elaborating a little more on like the motivation and how you went about making those decisions of what to include and what to cut.
Yeah, so I would say that because I'm a professor and I teach during the school year, I didn't have any like course releases to collect footage or anything like this. So I had to do this in the summer. And over the course of 2 summers, I collected footage, which meant that I was, going back to South Dakota. The first time was in between, after I left Rice University, I had a postdoc there, and I was on my way to Middlebury in Vermont, and I stopped in South Dakota and Minnesota on my way. And then it was another summer or 2 later that I collected more footage. And I didn't intend to collect more footage, but it turns out that like I just didn't have enough B-roll. I had a lot of people talking with me, and we just needed more. So the process, it ended up happening over the course of like 3 years, which is pretty surprising because it's not a long film, but still it was like a 3-year process. And I went through working with different people who, for like students, they start and then they graduate, and also the students I worked with were undergraduate students, some of whom were film and media studies majors, but some of whom were not. And they didn't necessarily know anything about filmmaking. And the students who were film and media studies students did, but like, you only know so much after taking 2 undergraduate classes, right? I mean, they knew more than me, but they didn't know a whole lot. So mostly we were just like a rogue team of hooligans who were trying to tell a story that we were all interested in telling. And so I think that, like, probably for most filmmakers, the process is a little bit, I don't know, there's probably more of a plan that you follow. And ours was just sort of like, all right, we're showing up. Like, who can we interview now? Like, when are we going to go where? Oh gosh, we're here. We have to get as much footage as we can in this week because I have to go back to work, you know? So it was really a little bit haphazard. And that's partly a reflection of the fact that was just a brand new filmmaker. And it's a reflection of the fact that we were doing this on almost no budget, I think. But I also think that, like, that in some ways the topic necessitated that. Like, I think that the people I interviewed would have been nervous or would have been off-put if I had reached out 6 months in advance and said, I'm going to be in South Dakota next summer. Would you be interested in this? I was there and I'm like, hi, do you have any time in the next 2 days to be interviewed? Everybody who I reached out to said yes. Everybody I reached out to who I had interviewed for my book made the time. And I think that's pretty amazing, you know, that they all thought that this project was worth their time after I'd interviewed them for a book that hadn't even come out yet. You know, like, I felt like there was a lot of faith in me. And so to me, a big part of the process was just trying to put into the film, like, to have the same faith in myself that I was seeing other people have in me. And really just, like, belief that I would tell their story in a way that felt true to them. And that feels like a real honor and a real responsibility. And so that was why it was very painful for me to cut, because I said, everybody I interviewed, I want included at least to some degree. And people who were editing the film were like, well, normally you would just pick like one person and follow them and then tell a story through that person. And I didn't want to do that because, for a couple of reasons. One, I think that there's already a tendency to write off rural places and rural people. And if there's one person saying something, it's a lot easier to write them off as an anomaly, as like somebody who is unlike other people. Like, oh, this is a really charismatic person, so of course they fit in just fine in their rural place, but they would fit in fine everywhere, right? And so I wanted to show that there's a range of in some ways, quite similar ideas about, at least about where they live and how their feelings about where they live and how they feel in terms of being included or not included. And so I didn't want to tell I didn't want to follow 1 or 2 or 3 people in this version of the project. I wanted the film to be a reflection of my respect for my interviewees too. And I think that it's hard to do that if you don't see yourself in the final cut after people give you their time and trust you with their stories. So I guess the process was like me coming to terms with the fact that this doesn't need to be an hour-long film. And in fact, it's better that it's not. And that I still got in all of the people, but we see less of each of them. And I'm okay with that trade-off. But it was, you know, that was a part of the process, I think, of making the film. So there was like the process of collecting the footage, and then there's the process of actually editing the footage, and then there's the process of circulating the final cut. And so I'm just really grateful to Films Media Group that you took on this project.
Well, we're very excited about it. So last question, what advice would you give someone who's interested in making a film?
Oh, well, I would say do it. And I would say do it, but without too much expectation regarding what the final product will look like, and be open to the shape of the product changing radically. Like, I never, for instance, with this film, it includes an animation that some students did. Well, the reason that these students ended up working with me on this is they were working in my friend's animation lab, and I went in to give him feedback on an animation that he was making about abortion. He showed it on the big screen, and then another faculty member and I, who both work on abortion politics, we came in and we like gave him feedback. And then I just started talking to my friend about this film and where we were at with it. And then some students in the room were like, whoa, we want to work on that project, this metronormativity film. And then we were like, well, how could you do that? And they were like, we want to make an animation. Like, I never had the idea that this film would include an animation. I never had the idea that this film would include a music video. Those were things that student collaborators brought to the project. And I think that the film is better for those contributions. And so to me, the benefit of this medium is not only that it can reach a lot of people, but that it is flexible enough that you can do something wildly creative and it can still fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good advice. I really like that. Like, just to be open to the process and how the process can lead the film into something that you may not have envisaged before. And I do agree with you. I think that both the music video and that animation really add a lovely dimension to the film, and they make it a lot more visually interesting.
Yeah, totally. And I hope too that when students watch the film, they can see, oh, this animation was made by a student. This video, it's all students in the music video. They did convince me to be in a scene at the very end on the filming day. And it was very fun. Like, the whole thing was very fun to be making a music video and to be bringing everybody together. So I think, just like as with anything, the more fun we have, the better the product is, you know? So, and the more
Absolutely.
collaborative it is, the better the product is too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Carly. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. And I'll say to our subscribers, please check out In Plain Sight, which again is available on Films on Demand and on Access Video on Demand. And if you don't have a subscription, you can sign up for a free trial. Thanks so much, Carly.
Thank you so much for your time. This was really a lot of fun.